Welcome back to the MOOC course on corporate social responsibility. My name is Aradhana Malik and I have been helping you with this course. This is the very last lecture of the course. Thank you very much for participating on the forum. Thank you very much for your bright ideas. Thank you very much for your responses and suggestions. It's been great interacting with you. Now, I've given you a lot of ideas and I may have missed some points, and I'm sorry for that, but I've tried my best to give you as comprehensive, as diverse and as well researched input into the field of corporate social responsibility. I hope you've enjoyed these lectures. So in this lecture, we are just going to summarize everything. We'll just very quickly go through everything we have discussed, and I wish we were together so you could have interrupted me if you had any questions. However, we don't have that opportunity, so we will just have to manage with what we have here. Okay. So to start with, we discussed what CSR was, then we talked about corporate philanthropy, then we talked about strategic corporate philanthropy, then we discussed the CSR pyramid, very important, please don't forget it, this is the basis for CSR. Then we moved on to the hierarchy. We were talking about what CSR was. We talked about economic responsibility, different responsibilities in the CSR hierarchy. We talked about culture and context. We discussed the moral argument for CSR, and we talked about the iron law of social responsibility, which states that in a democratic society, power is taken away from those who abuse it. Don't ever forget this. This is very important. You have something, you keep it, you use it wisely, it stays with you. You abuse it, it goes away. Okay. We talked about CSR and profits. We talked about why CSR was important, and we ended the discussion with some examples of socially irresponsible behavior. Okay. Then we moved on to theories of CSR. We talked about how organizations legitimize their operations. Various theories were discussed, stakeholder theory, then we discussed various perspectives. We talked about the institutional theory, we discussed the instrumental theories, we discussed political and integrative theories, we discussed ethical theories. Then I'll just rush through this here. Okay. Then we talked about why CSR was important, and we discussed the impact of CSR. We talked about antecedents of CSR here. We talked about CSR motives at various levels of analysis, why people and organizations indulged in CSR efforts. We talked about 4 levels: individual, organizational, national and intergovernment levels, transnational levels. Okay. Then we talked about the evolution of CSR and how it came to be what it is today. We discussed the history of CSR development, and we discussed the work of various people. So all stalwarts, all of these names are very important for you. I've referred to some of their papers in the following lectures. We talked about the history. We talked about the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ICESR, adopted by the UN. We talked about UNESCO. We talked about the Commonwealth Arbitration Commission, etc. Then we talked about the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We talked about the United Nations and its efforts. Then we talked about the European Universities Charter for Sustainable Development and what they had their efforts in promoting university education for the training of teachers. Then we talked about the Copernicus guidelines by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. We talked about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So various agencies. We talked about the UNFCCC, the OECD we've referred to many times even after this. We talked about the Social Accountability International Initiative. Uh, hmm, so yeah, so then we discussed the Global Compact. We discussed it later also. We talked about various indices, FTSE for Good Index, etc. Then we talked about CSR in India. We talked about CSR efforts in India. We talked about evolution of Indian CSR, different phases. Hmm. We talked about the models of social responsibility in India, Gandhian model, or the ethical model, the statist model or the Nehruvian model, the liberal model or the Friedman model, and the stakeholder or the Freeman model. Okay. Um, then we talked about CSR drivers in Indian organizations. We talked about various discussion points for the forum. Many of you participated in these discussions, and that was very nice. Thank you so much. Then, the discussion continued. We discussed the national voluntary guidelines in detail and the principles of the NVGs. Then we talked about the Indian Companies Act, and then we talked about stakeholders and CSR. We had talked about the stakeholder theory. Now in this we talked about how different stakeholders contributed to CSR. So we talked about the especially in light of the online stakeholders, we discussed the model. Then we talked about the benefits demanded by stakeholders. We talked about the resource dependence theory. And we talked about the stakeholder approach and various issues between stakeholders. Then here, so we talked about the basis for stakeholder theory in CSR, and we talked about what stakeholder theory was not. Then we talked about the stakeholder theory in action. And we also discussed what an amoral organization would be, what a legalistic organization would be, what a responsive organization would be, and what an ethical organization would be. Then we discussed how do you identify stakeholders, so and how do you form a relationship with stakeholders. We talked about stakeholder salience. Then we talked about sorting of stakeholders based on their salience. Then we discussed the comprehensive stakeholder management process model. We talked about assessing stakeholders. We talked about factors affecting stakeholders, potential for threat and cooperation. We talked about strategies for managing stakeholders. Then we talked about stakeholder dialogue, very, very important, especially in the context of mega projects, as we discussed in the last lecture. Mega projects in forestry and socially stigmatized industries, extremely important to indulge in a dialogue with stakeholders. Then so we discussed various aspects of stakeholder dialogue. Then we talked about the paradigms of social responsibility, the planning of CSR activities. We talked about how CSR activities are planned. Then we talked about comparison of the three paradigms that we had discussed, which were the CSR pyramid, the intersecting circles, and the concentric circles paradigm, and we discussed them on various parameters. Then we moved on to CSR design and implementation and the stakeholder integration in the design and implementation of CSR. So we discussed Kramer's framework, we discussed Kuh and Tan's framework, we discussed Magnan's framework, we discussed Panapanan's framework, we discussed Vere's framework, then we discussed the stakeholder expectations. We discussed Maon and his associates' framework for designing and implementing CSR. So different steps, sensitize, unfreeze, then do, move. We talked about the critical success factors in the CSR process, we talked about CSR activities, we talked about corporate social performance, and we talked about Professor Prakash Sethi's contributions to to the study of CSR as far as corporate social performance was concerned. Extremely important. Professor Sethi is a stalwart. He's one of the authorities, leading authorities in the world on corporate social responsibility and social performance. Okay, so we talked about different dimensions of behavior. Then we talked about the CSR process. We talked about phases and steps in the CSR process. We talked about a model for managing CSR. We talked about the steps for building a strategy for responsible business. Again, this was based on the NVGs, the National Voluntary Guidelines, the principles of which we had talked about earlier. So, this was with special reference to India. Then we talked about CSR activities, different types of CSR activities, what they look like. Then we talked about the evaluation of CSR. How do you evaluate CSR activities? We talked about three main questions. Who do you think you are socially responsible to? What are you socially responsive about? And what should your social performance be judged against which standard should it be discussed, and by whom? So, very, very important questions in the evaluation process. Then we discussed the basis of evaluation. We talked about the tests of effectiveness of CR. We talked about the measurement of CSR. We talked about indices to rate CSR. We talked about various sustainability indices. We talked about the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the FTSE Russell Index, the Ethical Sustainability Index, Global Challenges Index, Stocks Global ESG Leaders, Heng Sustainability Index Series, etc. The one we did not talk about was the KLD, but I just thought it would be more relevant to discuss these other ones here. Then we discussed an example of CSR. We talked about the Robeco-SAM Sustainability Index. We then here. So, we then started the discussion on corporate governance. Sorry, this was part of the Robeco-SAM Index. And then we talked about materiality. We talked about risk and crisis management, again as part of the Robeco-SAM Index, various aspects, various parameters here. Then we talked about the social dimension, and human capital dimension, etc. So, we discussed the Robeco-SAM Index in great detail. Then we talked about CSR evaluation in India. We discussed these principles once again, and we talked about the details of each principle. Then we talked about corporate governance. Then the discussion moved to corporate governance. We talked about the definitions of corporate governance. We talked about specific activities covered under corporate governance. We talked about the background. We talked about theories of corporate governance. We talked about the typology of corporate governance theories and ethics, tried to compare various theories. Then we discussed the reasons for corporate governance and why it is useful to have. Then we discussed models and systems of corporate governance. We discussed different models here, and I gave you some homework. And then we talked about implementing corporate governance and how you can implement corporate governance. Then we talked about the board of directors, what it does and how that ties in with CSR. We talked about the balanced scorecard. We talked about the issue of committees. Then we talked about the types of boards. Then we discussed the principles of corporate governance, from various perspectives, and we talked about the latest principles of corporate governance. So, I have given you both here. I have given you the principles that were the So then I gave you the principles. I've added a slide on the principles, a summary of the principles of corporate governance that were upgraded in 2004, but in the lecture I discussed the principles that were revised in 2015. So those slides are also going to be there for you. Then we moved on to the link between corporate governance and CSR. We talked about the relationship between CG and CSR. We talked about organizational climate and its effect on CSR, economic basis, etc. So how can you identify CSR duties of your organization? We talked about the social contract as a criterion for strategic management. We talked about logic of a CSR strategic management standard. We talked about dialogue with stakeholders, CSR and corporate governance, various aspects, and how have different countries embedded CSR in corporate governance. And the slides on corporate governance in India will also be given to you, so they will be in your folder. Though we did not discuss it, I asked you to find this out, but they will be in your folder. Then we talked about models connecting corporate governance to CSR and how corporate governance affects CSR. Then we talked about the application of the stakeholder systems model of CSR. See, CSR does not happen on its own. CSR requires the inputs by stakeholders. CSR means, when we talk about social responsibility, we are talking about people who are connected to the organization. So you'll find a lot of references to stakeholders in these slides, okay, and that is the reason why. Then we talked about we talked about CSR and sustainability, and we started the discussion with corporate citizenship. We talked about the rights of citizens, etc. We had an extended discussion on corporate citizenship. I had promised you earlier that we would have a module meaning I've given you as much information as was required for the purpose of this course in this, and within the timeline that we had. We talked about stages of corporate citizenship. We talked about the elements and issues in corporate citizenship. We talked about strategic advantages of corporate citizenship, indicators, antecedents and consequences of corporate citizenship. Then we talked about corporate citizenship and CSR coming together. How does corporate citizenship contribute to CSR? Then we talked about sustainability and sustainable development, and so these were from another course that I had taught through this portal. I took the slides from there, but the description was definitely different. So we discussed the origins of sustainable development because it's so closely tied to CSR. The 4 C's, okay, building blocks. We talked about United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I showed the SDGs to you, the channels, etc., and the different texts. Then our discussion moved to corporate sustainability and corporate social responsibility, and then we talked about how these two came together. We talked about their synergy. We talked about the integration between sustainability and CSR. We talked about we discussed the summary of CSR codes pertaining to environmental health from a paper that was written with focus on mining industry, but it really applies to the overall environment. So, okay, we went back to the OECD guidelines. We discussed those also this time in the case of multinational enterprises. And okay, so then we talked about various other guidelines here, and I showed you different websites. So again, an amazing summary by Daimler published earlier this year. Then we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals Compass for Business Action on the SDGs. This discussion really brought the discussion on corporate sustainability together with CSR, and the SDG Compass is a wonderful tool. The website gives you so many ideas. I wish I could have a module, a 10-hour course only on the SDGs and sustainability and CSR. I mean, there's so much going on in the world. So, but I've given you these ideas. I hope I've given you enough stimuli so you can sort of go and explore these things on your own. Okay. So we discussed the SDG compass, and I took the report and I broke it up into parts, and I gave probably the entire report to you, through this lecture. But you can download it and read it on your own. Then we talked about various tools for mapping high impact areas across the value chain, and I gave you links and I showed you these websites, and I hope you enjoyed that. Then we discussed the compass for business action, etc. Now we talked about the key performance indicators, we talked about the various steps here. Then okay, then we talked about CSR public policies in different relational perspectives, and I found a paper that published these, that evaluated these in Europe, and I thought we could all derive lessons from this report. That is why the lecture is named as Lessons from Europe. And so we talked about how government really has been, so this was week 8, we just started the discussion, and how government has been contributing, or how government has been involved in CSR efforts in various capacities, and that is what this lecture was all about. Okay, and so then we couldn't finish everything in one shot, so we had to spread this over 2 lectures. Then we heard the podcast of an interview with Catherine Dovey in this, and we talked about the national resource centers, the national contact points all over Europe. We saw what they do, we saw examples of what they do. Okay, then we talked about the various aspects of the government business society nexus, and then we moved on to consumer social responsibility in week 8. Week 8 was a mixture of miscellaneous items. So consumer social responsibility, we discussed this in great detail. Then we moved on to why and how consumers become socially responsible, when do they take this decision. We talked about the multi-level, multi-agent conceptualization of consumer social responsibility. And then we talked about the determinants of consumer social responsibility, and then we moved on to this discussion on corporate social irresponsibility. We discussed this in great detail, and we talked about the other side of corporate social responsibility. Okay, and we talked about the 2 types of social irresponsibility, intentional and unintentional CSIR, and their different aspects. Then we discussed the dimensions of corporate social irresponsibility. We had discussions, we described, or we went into details on each dimension. Okay, and then we wound up this course with a discussion on various tiny ideas for the directions that corporate social responsibility could take in the future. For example, we talked about CSR initiatives in socially stigmatized industries. One more thing that I wanted to tell you that I did not put in the slides was CSR in socially stigmatized communities, CSR in high risk countries where there is social strife. So these are very special areas. I didn't put them on the slides, but I did think about them, and I thought I would share that with you. So socially stigmatized communities, for example, sanatoria where AIDS victims are being kept. I mean, people don't want to go there. Or, as was the case earlier, sanatoria for people with communicable diseases where they're isolated. Initially it used to be areas where people suffering from leprosy were kept, though thankfully that is not a problem these days. However, this new scare of AIDS and HIV has taken the world by a storm, and raising awareness has helped, but only to a limited extent. And once people come to know that somebody suffering from AIDS or has been detected positive for HIV, they want to really sever all contact with such a person. Now some movies have come up. There's one Hindi movie that I was watching, it was called My Brother Nikhil, and so that is one way of heightening, of increasing awareness about what these so-called socially stigmatized situations can be, but CSR with such in such situations, that can be one more area where CSR can go, and I mean where activities of the organizations can really help. So the film industry has done its bit. So they made a film with a purpose, so they do this. So a lot of other organizations can move into this, and CSR in countries ridden with civil strife, for example, how do you conduct CSR activities in places like Iraq or Afghanistan or maybe Israel, or I mean in pockets, yes, but then on a one has to be prepared that bomb may fall out of the sky at any minute and you could be killed. So what does a person do, so that, or maybe CSR with tribal populations where it's difficult to go, for example the Onges and the Sinhalese in the Andamans region. So these are tribals, and so it's very difficult. You don't want to disturb their natural environments, you don't want to disturb what's going on there, but you also want to help. Or the orphanages in Romania, and I have an example to share with you. I once interned many years ago. I interned at an orphanage in the city of Iași, spelled as IASI, in Romania, and I went with a group of students, other students from different parts of Europe, and I was studying in the United States, and I went there on an internship, and so we had to pay them. So there was part donation, and then the first day we went there, we went with all these bright ideas. Yeah, we'll do this, and the owner or the director or manager of the orphanage told us that thank you very much for coming here. All we want you to do is spend time with the children. So you go in with all these ideas. Yeah, we'll teach the children this and teach the children that. And this was an orphanage, but it was labeled as an orphanage, but it was really a home for children who had been abandoned because they were disabled, and very, very painful situation. I spent a good 3 weeks there, and I think it was 3 or 4 weeks, I forget. Anyway, so one learns a lot. So how do you implement activities there? And I went through the International Federation of Medical Students Associations based in Trondheim, Norway, but they did allow non-medical students like myself also to participate in this initiative. So that is another aspect where CSR could be there. So again, I did not discuss this as a part of this lecture, but ideas are coming to me. Of course, I'll tell you, one misses a lot of things when one is so excited, so I try to put everything in there. Anyway, so socially stigmatized industries, we talked about what socially stigmatized industries were. We talked about the mega project social responsibility, and how that could really be the future of CSR, or how CSR could be, or studies on CSR or efforts could really be taken up there. Then we talked about territorial social responsibility. Then we talked about sustainopreneurship. I showed you some examples of that here, and sustainable entrepreneurship and sustainopreneurship. Then we talked about CSR in forestry. We talked about CSR in wildlife. We talked about cyber stalking, a very surprising finding while I was looking for more information on how CSR is progressing. So if you're an organization, within your own capacity, within your own expertise, you can still help the community. You can raise awareness about cyber stalking. That is what this paper did. I wish I had the time to share the whole paper, a crux of the whole paper with you, but they identified what cyber stalking is, what affects cyber stalking, and how their interventions could help people who were being cyber stalked. And they found out the limitations in addressing these issues, and they really found out how their interventions could help. So within their own limitations, they didn't go out and build schools. They just did what they could within their own area of expertise. Amazing initiative, and a paper was written about it, and rightly so, they earned it. So these are some new ideas. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. We talked about heritage tourism and CSR in heritage tourism. Now this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and however, this is a start, and I hope that through this course you have got a lot of ideas that you can use in your quest for more information, for learning more about CSR, and you will actually take some of these ideas and implement them in your own organizations. And I'm talking especially to the industry professionals listening to this course. So I will have a surprise for you. I'm not going to declare it now. As far as the slides and the reading material is concerned, this course is over, but it's not really over. We will continue to talk. We will continue to address your issues. We will continue to stay in touch. Anyone who's interested in staying in touch, I will put a message up on the forum, and I would like you all to sign up and stay in touch even after the course is over, and we can take parts. And if you want any part of this course to be talked about more, please let us know through the feedback form, through the forum, and we will develop a specific course for you. Maybe a shorter course, maybe just a 10-hour course, but we will try and work something out together. Thank you very, very much for being so patient, for being so involved. It's been a pleasure teaching you, and I hope to interact with you more through other courses in your own areas of interest. Thank you very much.